In a world where blood ties are meant to protect and nurture, betrayal cuts the deepest. The father who gave him life, only to be given death in return, is a story woven with heartbreak, secrets, and vengeance. When love, trust, and family loyalty are shattered, what remains is a chilling journey of revenge that no one saw coming. Richard had always been the kind of man who carried the weight of the world on his shoulders without ever letting it show. His hands were calloused, evidence of years spent working jobs that wore down the body but never broke the spirit. He was a father before anything else, a man who believed that his true purpose in life was to ensure his only son, Daniel, had everything he himself never did. From the moment he first held the fragile newborn in his arms, Richard had promised silently to the universe that he would protect him, guide him, and give him every chance at a better life. His sacrifices began early, in small ways that accumulated into a mountain of burdens only he could carry. He skipped meals so Daniel could eat more, worked late shifts so there would be money for school, and walked home in the freezing rain so his son could have a warm coat when winter arrived. To outsiders, Richard appeared unshakable, the type of father every child wished they had. Yet beneath that stoic exterior lived a man who bore scars of loneliness, abandonment, and betrayal from his own past. What Richard wanted most was for Daniel to never feel the same void he once felt. He worked 2, sometimes 3 jobs, returning home long after Daniel had gone to bed, but he would still step quietly into his son's room to watch him sleep, whispering words of love the boy would never hear. Each paycheck went first toward Daniel's needs: books, clothes, school trips, while Richard patched his own shoes with tape and ignored his own dreams. He never complained, not once, even when his body ached, even when exhaustion gnawed at his bones, because he saw his sacrifices as a kind of currency. Every blister and bruise was a down payment on Daniel's future, and for Richard, that was enough. When Daniel was old enough to notice, he often asked why his father never rested, why he worked until his knuckles bled, why he looked so tired. Richard would smile in that tired way of his and say, "Because I want you to have more than I did, son. Because you're worth it." He meant every word, and though Daniel would nod quietly, something in his eyes lingered. A question, a shadow, something Richard didn't recognize but should have. Still, he ignored it, believing that love alone could fill the silent spaces between them. There were times when Richard's devotion seemed almost desperate, as if he were trying to make up for something invisible, some guilt he never spoke of. He made himself smaller so Daniel's life could be larger, dimmed his own light so his son could shine brighter. When neighbors whispered about how he was wasting away, how no man should work himself into the ground like that, Richard brushed them off. What did they know about what it meant to be a father? What did they know about promises? Every morning before dawn, he would lace his boots, pack his tools, and leave quietly so Daniel wouldn't wake to see him slipping away into another long day. And every night, no matter how drained he was, he would return with something, sometimes a new book, sometimes a favorite meal, sometimes just a story from his youth, to remind Daniel that he was never forgotten. Even in the smallest gestures, Richard's love was evident. He taped Daniel's drawings to the refrigerator like they were priceless works of art, attended every school performance even if it meant missing shifts that would cost him pay, and cheered the loudest at every small achievement. He never allowed himself to be the center of attention, always pushing his son forward, always keeping the spotlight on Daniel. If there was ever pain in his eyes, he hid it well, drowning it in his pride for the boy he called his reason for living. But love, no matter how deep, is sometimes invisible to the one who receives it. Daniel grew up in the shadow of a father who gave everything without keeping anything for himself. And though the world saw Richard as noble, Daniel saw something else. He saw a man who never seemed satisfied, a man who carried secrets, a man whose sacrifices felt like chains disguised as gifts. Richard never realized that in giving his all, he may have unintentionally built a wall between them, one made of duty and unspoken truths. He continued on, blind in his devotion, unaware that every sacrifice, every late night, every selfless act was slowly being rewritten in Daniel's mind as something else entirely. Daniel had grown up watching his father's sacrifices, but instead of gratitude blooming in his heart, something darker began to stir. As a child, he had admired Richard's strength, his relentless drive, his ability to shoulder every hardship without complaint. Yet as he got older, admiration twisted into confusion, then resentment. The long nights Richard spent working, the endless absence at the dinner table, the constant prioritization of survival over joy, all of it began to feel less like love and more like neglect. Daniel could not see the quiet devotion hidden in his father's exhaustion. He only saw a man who seemed to always be somewhere else, who offered gifts in place of presents, who loved from a distance. The whispers of bitterness began softly, creeping into his mind in moments when he felt most alone, until they grew loud enough to drown out the truth of his father's sacrifices. By the time Daniel reached adolescence, those whispers had become an internal chorus, fed by the world around him. Friends spoke of fathers who took vacations with their families, who laughed at the dinner table, who had time to coach soccer games and share advice about girls and dreams. Daniel compared his life to theirs and found it lacking. Where others had warm memories, he had cold nights and an empty chair across from him. Even the small gifts Richard brought home, books, meals, words of encouragement, felt like shallow substitutes for the presence he craved. Slowly, Daniel began to resent those very gifts, interpreting them not as love, but as evidence of a father trying to buy his way into his son's heart. The resentment might have remained unspoken, buried beneath the surface of adolescence, had it not been for the shadows that lurked in Daniel's environment. Family acquaintances, distant relatives, even strangers seemed to feed his doubts without realizing it. "Your father works too much," they would say casually, or "He's never around, is he?" Though the words were harmless in tone, to Daniel they were confirmation of what he already believed, that Richard's devotion was a mask, a performance meant to hide something darker. When a particularly bitter relative whispered in his ear that maybe Richard's sacrifices weren't for Daniel at all, but to bury a guilty past, the poison rooted itself deeper. Daniel began to wonder what secrets his father was keeping, why there was always a shadow behind his tired smile, and why love from him always seemed conditional. As Daniel's questions grew, so too did the silence between father and son. Richard, unaware of the storm brewing within the boy he cherished, continued in his routine of sacrifice and labor. He assumed Daniel understood, assumed love was clear in action even if left unspoken. But Daniel saw those same actions as distance, as a father who cared more for duty than connection. He began to shut himself off, responding to Richard's efforts with curt replies, rolling his eyes at his father's attempts at conversation, and withdrawing into a world where bitterness was easier to embrace than hope. Inside, Daniel wrestled with conflicting emotions he couldn't name. There were moments when he wanted to reach out, to ask his father why he worked so much, why he never seemed to have time to simply sit and listen. But pride and anger strangled the words in his throat. Instead, he listened to the whispers, both external and internal, that told him Richard's sacrifices were not love, but manipulation. That every late night wasn't for Daniel's future, but because his father had something to hide. That his life, shaped by Richard's choices, was not his own. And so resentment hardened into suspicion, suspicion into hostility. Daniel started searching for cracks in the image of his father. He scrutinized every story Richard told, looking for inconsistencies. He questioned every decision, every purchase, every absence. To him, the puzzle pieces no longer formed the picture of a devoted father, but of a man cloaked in secrecy. The more he searched, the more convinced he became that Richard was not the noble figure the world saw, but someone who had taken something from him: time, freedom, maybe even the truth of who he was meant to be. The whispers had done their work well. Daniel was no longer just a son growing up under the shadow of a hard-working father. He was a young man convinced he was owed answers. And in the space where love should have grown, suspicion now festered like an open wound, feeding a quiet but relentless rage that Richard never noticed until it was far too late. The secret had been buried for years, tucked away in the corners of Richard's past, wrapped in silence and shame. He had sworn to himself that Daniel would never know, that the mistakes of yesterday would not taint the boy's tomorrow. But secrets, no matter how carefully hidden, have a way of seeping through cracks, poisoning what they touch. For Richard, it began with small, unintentional slips: an old letter left in a drawer, a name whispered in his sleep, a sudden silence when certain topics arose. Daniel, already suspicious and searching for reasons to justify his growing resentment, picked up on these fragments. He watched his father closely, noticing the way Richard's eyes darkened when asked about his own parents, or how his hands trembled slightly whenever he spoke about the past. To Daniel, these were not quirks of a tired man, but clues, evidence of something deliberately concealed. The truth was darker than Daniel could have imagined. Richard, in his youth, had not always been the noble, self-sacrificing man Daniel knew. His life before fatherhood had been marred by desperation and choices he rarely allowed himself to remember. There had been a night of betrayal, his betrayal, when he made a decision that destroyed trust within the family he came from. He had betrayed his own brother in a way that led to tragedy, a rift so deep it never healed. And though Richard spent the rest of his life repenting, throwing himself into fatherhood as a kind of redemption, he carried the guilt like a chain around his neck. He told himself he was building a future for Daniel not just out of love, but out of penance, a way to atone for the bloodstains no one else could see. Daniel didn't uncover the full story all at once. It came to him in shards, each one sharper than the last. First came a faded photograph he found in a box in the attic, his father with a man he had never met, their smiles bright and untroubled. On the back of the photo was a note, a name scribbled with affection. Daniel asked Richard about it, and his father brushed it off with a strained smile, saying it was someone from long ago. But the stiffness in his tone only fueled Daniel's suspicions. Later came the letter, yellowed with age, that spoke of betrayal, of a brother lost not to death but to betrayal so severe it was as though he had died. The words were vague, but they dripped with pain, and though Daniel could not understand them completely, he understood enough. His father had secrets. The final piece came from the whispers of that same bitter relative who had always planted doubts in Daniel's mind. Over coffee one afternoon, their voice was sharp and deliberate, telling Daniel a story of Richard's past, of choices that destroyed bonds of blood, of shame that sent him running into a new life, where he tried to bury his sins under the mask of a hard-working father. Daniel listened, his heart pounding, his mind filling in the blanks with venom. To him, the story was no longer about a man trying to redeem himself. It was about hypocrisy. How could Richard demand respect, love, and trust when he himself had betrayed his own flesh and blood? How could a man who had once destroyed his own family pretend to be the perfect father now? The discovery did not bring clarity or understanding. It brought fury. Daniel felt cheated, as though the foundation of his life had been built on lies. Every sacrifice Richard had made suddenly seemed tainted, a desperate attempt not to love his son, but to silence his guilt. The long hours, the exhaustion, the endless devotion, it all looked different now. In Daniel's eyes, it was not love, but penance, not fatherhood, but self-punishment. And Daniel, rather than feeling valued, felt like nothing more than a symbol of Richard's shame, a tool for redemption he had never agreed to be. What cut deepest was not the betrayal itself, but the silence. Richard had never told him, never trusted him with the truth. That silence grew louder than any confession could have been, and Daniel interpreted it as proof that his father had never truly seen him as an equal, as someone worthy of honesty. The bond between them, already fragile, cracked under the weight of the secret. Where there might have been forgiveness or compassion, Daniel instead let anger take root, convincing himself that the man who gave him life had built their relationship on lies. From that moment, love and trust ceased to exist. In their place grew an obsession to make Richard pay, to strip away the mask of sacrifice and expose the hypocrite beneath. What Richard had tried so desperately to bury had now become the very weapon that would be used against him, forged in Daniel's hands with a rage that only betrayal by blood could ignite. Daniel's discovery of his father's secret did not erupt into an immediate confrontation. Instead, it settled into him like a poison, slow and steady, corroding whatever strands of love and loyalty remained. The anger did not shout, it whispered. It whispered when he sat across from Richard at the dinner table, watching his father's tired smile and wondering how many more lies hid behind it. It whispered when Richard praised him for achievements at school, words that once might have inspired pride but now felt hollow, tainted by hypocrisy. It whispered late at night when Daniel lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying the fragments of truth he had uncovered, stitching them into a narrative of betrayal so sharp it cut deeper each time he thought about it. At first, Daniel tried to bury his fury the way Richard had buried his past. He tried to live as though nothing had changed, as though the knowledge he now carried was not reshaping every memory of his childhood. But silence is not the same as peace. The longer he kept his anger hidden, the more it grew, feeding off itself, twisting his perception of every interaction. When Richard returned late from work, Daniel no longer saw sacrifice. He saw a man running from the ghosts of his mistakes. When Richard placed a hand on his shoulder in comfort, Daniel no longer felt love. He felt control, a performance meant to bind him to a lie. Every act of kindness, every gesture of fatherhood became evidence of manipulation in Daniel's mind. It was then that the shift began, quiet and deliberate. Daniel stopped looking at his father as a man to love and began to see him as a man to outsmart. He withdrew further, his responses clipped, his expressions unreadable. Richard noticed, of course. How could he not? But he mistook it for the natural distance of youth, believing his son was simply growing older, seeking independence. He never suspected that beneath the surface Daniel was not just pulling away, he was planning. The planning began small, almost imperceptible. Daniel started keeping a journal, but it was not filled with dreams or secrets of adolescence. It was filled with observations. He wrote down Richard's routines, the times he left for work, the hours he returned, the way he reacted to certain questions, the things that seemed to unsettle him. He wrote about his father's exhaustion, about the way his hands trembled when bills piled up, about the sadness that sometimes flickered across his face when he thought no one was watching. To anyone else, these might have been the notes of a son trying to understand his father. But for Daniel, they were the beginnings of a strategy, a careful collection of weaknesses to be used when the time was right. Hatred, once seated, thrives in silence. Daniel didn't lash out, didn't confront his father with accusations. Instead, he smiled when Richard was looking and seethed when he wasn't. He learned patience, biding his time, letting the anger simmer until it was strong enough to sustain him. He began rehearsing conversations in his head, imagining how he would expose his father, how he would strip away the carefully constructed image Richard had built, how he would make him feel the same betrayal and helplessness that Daniel felt. But planning revenge is not just about strategy, it is about transformation. And Daniel was transforming. The boy who once longed for his father's attention had hardened into someone colder, someone who believed love was weakness and vengeance was strength. He stopped confiding in friends, stopped seeking comfort, stopped allowing himself to feel anything but anger. It was easier that way, cleaner. The softer parts of him, the boy who had once drawn pictures for his father, who had once beamed with pride at his approval, were being buried piece by piece, just as Richard had buried his own past. Richard, for his part, noticed the growing distance but could not grasp its depth. He would sit across from Daniel, trying to start conversations, only to be met with vague answers or silence. Sometimes he would catch a look in his son's eyes, sharp, calculating, almost hostile. But he brushed it aside, convincing himself it was just adolescence. He never asked the deeper questions, never pushed hard enough to uncover the truth because he feared what he might find. And so the distance grew, unnoticed by the man who still believed his sacrifices were enough to bind them together. In Daniel's mind, though, the outcome was already written. The man who gave him life had forfeited the right to keep it. Every day the idea took clearer shape, no longer just an impulse but a mission. He did not think of it as murder. He thought of it as justice. Justice for the lies. Justice for the secrets. Justice for a childhood he believed was stolen from him. And so he waited, quietly sharpening his hatred, silently weaving his revenge into the fabric of their daily lives, until the time would come when silence could no longer hold it back. Richard had lived his entire life believing that love could withstand silence, that the strength of his sacrifices spoke louder than words ever could. But in the quiet moments, those rare pauses between work and exhaustion, he began to sense something shifting. It started with glances, the way Daniel's eyes lingered on him not with warmth or admiration, but with a coolness Richard couldn't explain. It was subtle at first, the kind of thing a weary father might dismiss as teenage moodiness. Yet as the weeks passed, the looks grew sharper, more deliberate, like shadows trailing behind Daniel's every expression. Richard felt it in the air between them, heavy and tense, like a storm gathering just beyond the horizon. He tried to ignore it, tried to convince himself it was nothing. But a father knows, even when he doesn't understand. At dinner, Richard would sometimes catch Daniel watching him closely, his fork untouched, his silence louder than words. When Richard asked about school, Daniel's answers were clipped and rehearsed, as if every word had been measured before leaving his mouth. There was no laughter, no spark of the boy he once knew. It was as though a wall had been built between them, brick by brick, day by day, while Richard had been too busy working, too consumed with keeping their lives afloat to notice the construction. He began to feel like a guest in his own home, unwanted and unwelcome, though he couldn't name why. The unease followed him into his work, gnawing at the back of his mind. He replayed old conversations, wondering if he had said something wrong, if he had failed to explain enough, love enough, listen enough. He tried harder, bringing home Daniel's favorite meals, asking more questions, sitting across from him in the evenings just to be near. But the harder he tried, the more distant Daniel became. The silence was no longer the silence of a busy household or the natural distance of growing up. It was a silence laced with intent, with judgment, with something Richard could not quite name but felt deeply. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, Richard would wake to find his chest tight, as though his heart itself was warning him. He would get up quietly, wander into Daniel's room and watch his son sleeping. The boy's face, calm and rest, reminded him of the child he had once held, the boy who used to cling to his hand and beam at his approval. For a moment, Richard would feel reassured, convincing himself that whatever distance had grown between them was temporary, something that time and patience would mend. Yet as he turned away and walked back into the loneliness of his own room, the unease returned, heavier than before. The truth was, Richard had begun to sense betrayal long before he could name it. He noticed the missing pages from his old journals, the way drawers seemed disturbed, as though someone had been searching through them. He noticed Daniel's habit of watching him, not with the curiosity of a son, but with the scrutiny of an investigator. He noticed the way questions about the past came suddenly, deliberately, as though designed to trip him into revealing something. Each time Richard felt a chill, an instinct he couldn't ignore. Daniel knew something. He didn't know how much, didn't know from where, but he knew his son had discovered pieces of the past he had worked so hard to bury. Still, Richard hesitated. Fear of the truth kept him from speaking. He could have sat Daniel down, confessed everything, laid bare the mistakes of his youth and begged for understanding. But he didn't. He told himself Daniel was not ready, that revealing the past would only hurt him more, that silence was still the kinder path. In reality, Richard was afraid of losing the one bond he had left, afraid of being seen not as a father but as a failure. So he said nothing, even as suspicion grew in Daniel's eyes, even as silence hardened into something colder, more dangerous. There were moments when Richard almost confronted it. Once, as Daniel walked past him in the hallway, their shoulders brushing, Richard felt an intensity in his son's gaze that stopped him in his tracks. It was not the gaze of a boy, it was the gaze of someone carrying judgment, someone holding something sharp behind their eyes. Richard opened his mouth, wanting to ask, "What's wrong, son? What do you know?" But the words caught in his throat. He let Daniel walk away without speaking, the silence stretching into a chasm he could no longer bridge. By the time Richard realized the danger, it was already too late. The bond had cracked beyond repair, and the boy he had sacrificed everything for was no longer his boy at all. He was something else now, calm, distant, calculating. Richard could feel it in every interaction, a sense that Daniel was waiting for something, preparing for something. And though he didn't know what it was, the weight of it pressed against his chest like a premonition he could not shake. A father knows when love has turned against him. He knew it in his bones, even as he tried to deny it. But knowledge without action is powerless, and Richard's silence, his endless silence, had become the very weapon that ensured his undoing. The house was silent the night it happened, the kind of silence that presses against the walls and makes every breath sound too loud. Richard had just returned from another grueling shift, his body aching, his mind heavy with thoughts of Daniel. The unease that had haunted him for weeks felt unbearable now, a weight he could no longer push aside. He wanted to speak, to bridge the gap with words he had been too afraid to say. But when he stepped into the living room, he found Daniel waiting, not with the awkward warmth of a son, but with the cold stillness of a stranger. The boy's eyes, once filled with life and innocence, were unreadable now. Dark pools reflecting something Richard had prayed he would never see. Hatred. For a moment, neither spoke. Richard opened his mouth, then closed it, struggling for words that could cut through the silence. He thought of telling the truth at last, of confessing every sin, every secret, of laying bare the man he truly was in the desperate hope of salvaging what remained. But before he could, Daniel spoke first. His words were quiet, steady, laced with venom Richard could not mistake. "You don't deserve to be my father." The sentence pierced deeper than any blade could. Richard staggered under the weight of it, unable to find breath, unable to recognize the boy he had raised in the young man standing before him. Daniel's voice grew sharper, each word a weapon honed over months of silent planning. He recited fragments of the past, the secrets Richard thought were buried, the betrayals he had spent his life trying to atone for. Every sentence was an accusation, every syllable a reminder that silence had not protected Daniel. It had poisoned him. Richard tried to explain, tried to reach out. But Daniel's eyes burned with the certainty of someone who no longer sought answers, only judgment. "You gave me life," Daniel said, his tone like ice, "but you stole the truth, and for that you'll pay." The moment felt suspended in time, a fragile thread stretched taut between them. Richard saw flashes of memory, Daniel's first steps, his laughter as a child, the nights Richard had held him when he was sick, the promises whispered into the dark. All of it now shattered, reduced to ash in the fire of his son's fury. He wanted to beg, to tell Daniel that every sacrifice had been love, that every secret had been a misguided attempt to protect him. But the words tangled in his throat, too late, too broken. Daniel moved with a calmness that chilled Richard to his core. There was no frenzy in his actions, no wildness of rage, only precision, the kind that comes from long preparation. He had thought of this moment, rehearsed it, waited for it. To him, it was not murder. It was justice, a balancing of scales that had been uneven his whole life. Richard, trembling, finally understood the depth of his son's resolve. He saw in Daniel's face not the boy he had raised, but the executioner he had created, forged in silence, resentment, and buried truths. The confrontation unfolded like a grim ritual. Richard pleaded now, his voice cracking with desperation, his hands outstretched in a final attempt to reach the sun slipping away before his eyes. "Daniel, please. I'm still your father." But the word father meant nothing now. It was an empty title stripped of its power. Daniel's expression did not falter. "You were never a father," he whispered, his tone final, merciless. And then he acted. The act itself was swift, but the impact eternal. Richard felt the betrayal not just in his body, but in his soul. The realization that the child he had poured his life into had chosen to end it. Pain, both physical and emotional, consumed him as he fell, his vision blurring, his breath shallow. He looked at Daniel one last time, searching for hesitation, for remorse, for some fragment of the boy he once knew. But there was nothing, only cold resolve, only silence. As darkness closed in, Richard's final thoughts were not of anger but of regret. Regret for the secrets he had kept, for the silence he had allowed, for the distance he had mistaken as normal. Regret that love so freely given had not been enough to save him. His last breath carried no curse, only a broken wish. That somehow in the ruins of this tragedy, his son might one day understand the truth he had never found the courage to speak. When it was over, Daniel stood in the silence of the house, his chest rising and falling in steady rhythm. He felt no triumph, no satisfaction, only emptiness, a hollow space where vengeance had burned so brightly. The man who gave him life was gone, and in that absence Daniel realized the terrible weight of what he had done. Yet he did not weep, did not falter. He simply stood there, the executioner of his own blood, the architect of a tragedy born not in violence, but in silence, secrecy, and broken love.